Hi, everyone, and welcome. What we believe to be the cause of a problem dictates how we go about solving and treating that problem. For instance, if you believe the cause of your headache to be your caffeine consumption, then you can go about treating that headache by regulating your coffee, tea, or even chocolate consumption in a day. Because no one out there really believes the cause of their headache is ibuprofen or aspirin deficiency. In this video, I wanted to explore some concepts about emotions. What are they? What's their purpose? How are they generated? And then to link this to the principles and practices of mind-body medicine, such as meditation, breathwork, biofeedback, to show how by employing these techniques, these skills, these practices, we might be able to cultivate balance, wellness, and change in our lives. So let's go. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I made this video for several reasons. First, I wanted to provide a framework for conceptualizing and understanding these things we call emotions. And all too often, we operate on this belief that emotions are something that just descend upon us and take us over. And as such, we're subject to their whims, to their changes, victims to emotions. When we have a framework that helps us understand how these experiences are created, then we have a clear sense of how we can work with our emotions, work with our experiences. To this end, I hope to offer a few thoughts about how some of the core basic skills of mind-body medicine can provide us insights in learning how to be present to, sit with, and perhaps even regulate our emotions and experiences. So, as with this or any video you come across on the internet, by me or anyone else, information you come across in a textbook, research paper, podcast, etc., remember that all this information is subject to change. I hope you keep an open mind and recognize that knowledge, data, continues to grow and expand. I mean, there's so many experts out there who talk to us as if they have the definitive answer. This is what science shows. And often those experts are unaware of any additional or even contradictory data or research because they're so focused on their own silo. What we believe today to be fact may be shown to be unfounded later. And in the 30 plus years that I have been involved in healthcare, I can say repeatedly, time and time again, I've seen this change. Now, this doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater or throw in the towel, whatever the expression is. At any given moment, we make the best decision with the information we have. So I'm just presenting some perspectives on how emotions are made, how they're constructed, with the hopes of talking about ways we can work with our experience. So let's take a look. We all seem to have this idea about what emotions and feelings are, but when pressed to explain them, many of us stumble. In English, the word feeling is used for both sensations and for those experiences in the body, like hunger, nausea, chills, aches, pains, as well as those things that we call emotions, such as sadness and fear and anger and joy and depression. And our journey is going to begin with the first part of this definition of feelings. So, my first question to all of you is, how do we make sense of the world? How do we? How do we know the world even exists? How do we know there is a world? How do we know anything for that matter? Our knowledge of the world begins with our senses. We know something is happening through the experience of our senses. We see it with our eyes, we hear it with our ears, we smell it with our nose, we taste it with our tongue, and we touch it come in contact with it through our skin, our muscles. Of course, touch is just such more complex. It's a complicated sense, but for now, let's just leave it at there. That these senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, are what we call exteroception, the detection and perception of stimuli that originate outside the body. Now, this can be contrasted to sensations detected from the inside of the body, what we feel. Remember that word, feel, or sense. We might feel the heartbeat and the force of its contraction. We might notice the rate at which we breathe, which of course involves a host of other senses like the stretch of the muscles, the movement of the spine, bones, and joints. We might sense the digestive tract and the sensations like fullness, hunger, nausea, burning. And as I already mentioned, we can sense the movement of our body and limbs, and that's something called proprioceptive awareness. We can have the internal kinesthetic awareness, which is awareness of the body and its relationship to other body parts, as well as to its relationship to objects in the environment. And all of these internal sensations are called interoception. So, information about the external or internal world is carried to our brain through our sensory nerves. And those are called afferent nerves. Sensory input goes to the brain, and that is contrasted with efferent nerves. Those are channels between the brain to the body where the brain is sending a signal down to the body. So to repeat, exteroception it's the detection and perception of stimuli that originate outside the body, and interoception is the detection and perception of stimuli that originate inside the body. So right now, if your eyes are closed and you're not looking at the screen, you wouldn't see a picture that I took last year of a river with part of a dead tree lying across it. That brings me to the age-old question that I have heard many a neuroscientist ask. If a tree falls in the wood and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? I heard Lisa Feldman Barrett, who I will discuss in a bit, mention this question recently. Well, based on our understanding of how we understand the world, the answer would be no. If there is no one to hear it, no ear to hear it, then it doesn't make a sound. When the tree falls, it does cause a displacement of molecules in the air, and that displacement creates air pressure changes. But with no detection mechanism, we could say there is no sound, because the sound is an aspect of the brain. Those changes in air pressure then land or touch, impress upon the eardrum or tympanic membrane, and that creates movement, mechanical energy, which in turn causes the ossicles, which are the bones of the middle ear, to vibrate, which then displaces the foot of the stapes, which is the third middle ear bone, and it goes into the cochlea, which is in the inner ear. And all of that is to say that this mechanical vibrational energy is then transmuted to an electrical signal, which then travels through the auditory nerve to the brain. Whew. So, without the ears to detect the sensory input from the outside world, exteroception, and without a brain to detect this now electrical signal, there is no sound. I'm not sharing this as a philosophical debate. I've heard, as I said, other neuroscientists use this example so that we can apply it to the concept of the brain and emotions. Let me try to demonstrate this another way. Let me use another example that I've used in class for decades when I talk about guided imagery and hypnotherapy. A lemon. If you look at this image, or even if you just close your eyes and you think of a lemon, imagine taking a slice of a freshly cut lemon and then squeezing a drop of the juice onto your tongue. Pause for a moment. What is happening right now in your body? And as you'll come to learn, one of my favorite questions, how do you know what is happening right now in your body? So if you are like me, you notice your mouth puckering and salivating, then that is an example of interoception. You know your mouth is puckering because the sensory nerves in the mouth are sending a signal to the brain telling you what is happening. You feel, you sense saliva and moisture accumulating in your mouth. But interestingly, there is no lemon present. The lemon only exists in your mind. Now you're seeing an image of a lemon, but there is no lemon that you are tasting. And furthermore, it only exists in your mind because of previous experiences with it. Now, I have seen, I've touched, I've smelled, I've tasted a lemon. And that previous experience gets recorded in my brain so that days, weeks, months, even years after touching or tasting a lemon, my brain holds a categorization, a representation of what lemon means. And this is a direct example of how emotions are constructed. What do we mean by the word emotion? Well, some people say it comes from the old French, émouvoir, which means to move out. And that might be one of the reasons why people profess that our emotions need to be expressed. But that still doesn't tell us what they are. Most of us think of them as both internal and external experiences. The internal is something we feel, and the external is that outward expression of these internal experiences, such as facial expressions, body language, body posture, tone of voice, breathing patterns. Again, that still does not get us any closer to understand what they are. So let's take a brief look at some commonly held theories of emotions, not so that you'll commit them to memory, but to show some of the thinking around them. So the first is the most famous in the evolution of modern psychotherapy and psychology by William James, the James Lang theory of emotion. And James wrote, "We do not shiver because we are scared of the lion, but we shiver, and this is what we feel as our fear." And this is going to really get into our theories of constructed emotion. So, very first thing that happens is we have some sensory input, exteroception, eliciting stimulus. We see a lion. There is a response behaviorally, but an instrumental response. We begin to move. And there's also a physiological and muscular reaction. Our muscles contract, our heart starts to race, and we interpret these physiological, muscular, and instrumental responses to say that is our emotion. So we don't shiver because we are scared of the lion. We shiver, and this is what we feel and call fear. Now, in cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive behavioral view of emotions, a little bit similar. Some things are different, though. It all begins with that sensory input. We make sense of the world from that sensory input. So there's an eliciting stimulus. We see the lion. But then there's this nebulous thing. We have this subjective experience of emotion. We call it fear. And then once we feel this fear, we begin to run and our heart races. Okay, that's a different order of things. There's other versions of this now. You can look at these. That's similar. They're just placing the order of these things differently. This brings me to Lisa Feldman Barrett and how emotions are made. In this 2017 book, professor, neuroscientist, researcher, Lisa Feldman Barrett, attempted to dispel that belief that not only are discrete parts of the brain responsible for specific emotions, but also this idea that emotions are universal and that everyone who's looking at you can recognize them. Based on her research and the research of other neuroscientists, Feldman Barrett suggests that emotions are constructed and created, the implication of which are fascinating as they suggest new ways of working with our experience. Notice that I'm saying that, working with our experience rather than working with our emotions or fixing our emotions or changing them. Since we are no longer victims to this nebulous, uncontrollable event. So basically, the process goes something like this. It begins with the same information. There's an eliciting stimulus. There is sensory input that the nervous system detects through either interoception, if it's something inside the body, or exteroception. We see, hear, smell, taste, touch something, feel something. Those signals go up to the brain and are detected by the brain, which then makes predictions about what the body will need to do based on that information that comes in. For example, when you saw the image or imagined the lemon, your brain predicted what was about to happen, that you were about to taste something that would be sour and tart. So to prepare for this, the brain sent signals down to the body to create what we call a simulation. It started the process as if it were about to happen. So the salivary glands were signaled to begin the release of enzymes and to release saliva, as well as other parts of the digestive tract to ready itself. Now, if we actually had a lemon in hand and squeezed juice onto our tongue, then the sensory information from the taste would go back to the brain for comparison. Did what actually occur meet with our prediction and simulation? The brain would compare these experiences with the previous predictions, allowing for the brain then to readjust or alter its working models. The process then gets resolved and it starts all over again. So let's break this down a little bit more. And let's use some other examples. This is everyone's favorite. If you're looking at the screen right now, I invite you to pause and reflect. What are you experiencing right now? And the follow-up question is, how do you know? What tells you? From an exteroception point of view, you are seeing an image of a snake. But what interoceptive information are you detecting right now? If you have never, ever seen a snake, or anything that looked like it, moved like it, felt like it, or even sounded like a snake before, you would most likely have an interoceptive response that was maybe minimal, maybe nothing at all. You might not have experienced anything. Maybe you found yourself curious, wondering, but without experiencing any strong sensations. This visual is being detected by the brain, where it will then make a prediction. And again, if you never saw anything like this before, you will try to predict what it is based on the information you already possess. Now, however, if you already have a concept of snake, the brain's prediction system is very swift, and the simulation occurs when the brain responds as if the snake were actually present. It uses bits of previous experience with a snake, what it looked like, sounded like, and felt like. So you detected it with your eye, it sent the signal up to the brain, then the brain sends the signal down, and your body begins to respond to the prediction, as maybe the muscles might begin to get engaged so you can run away from the snake. Or if your previous experience with snakes were positive, you might find yourself leaning down to pet it. Maybe. Regardless, the prediction is based on previous experience, and the simulation is the body preparing for what it predicts will happen. Predictions are based on past experiences, whether we are consciously aware of these predictions in the moment or not. An aspect to this predictive cycle is called priming, and that's when there's an exposure to some sensory input which influences our reactions without any awareness that this is happening. One example I have heard several people talk about is a study where one group of subjects viewed videos and images of people in nursing homes using walkers and canes and being assisted with their activities of daily living. The other group of subjects viewed images and videos of athletes engaged in their sports, running, climbing, and the like. The researchers, unbeknownst to the subjects, then measured the speed of their locomotion. After viewing these images and as they left the testing center and stood up and walked out, they measured how fast they moved. Lo and behold, no surprise here, those who viewed the images of athletes moved at a faster pace, regardless of age, gender, physical ability of the subjects. There are numerous experiments that have been done demonstrating how priming impacts our brain's prediction system. So it changes the firing of our neurons without any awareness on our part. Let me share an example that's personal. So I'm trying to discuss here predictions and simulations. Growing up, we had thoroughbred German Shepherds, 3 of them. And my experience was reinforced in my brain that these big dogs, not the puppies, but the big dogs, grown dogs, and maybe even most dogs in general at the time, were sweet and loving and kind and playful. So my brain categorized my concept of dog this way. So whenever I saw a dog, exteroception, saw a dog, all predictions were based on my concept, my categorization of dog. And that is the prediction part of my equation. Now, once the prediction gets made, the brain initiated a simulation. It sended efferent signals back down to my body to ready itself for whatever the prediction was that would happen. So remember the lemon. If the brain is predicting the body will experience a particular taste or chemical component on the tongue or mouth, it sends signals down to the body to ready itself for that tart, acidic liquid that is about to come in contact with. So here, likewise, my brain predicted that all dogs are cute and lovable, so it would ready itself to play with them. So let's put another pause here in the story for a moment to address this simulation issue. What is simulation? What is happening? This is a concept I believe that we all know and understand, and it's about the nervous system. Most discussions about the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are seeming to emphasize stress and therefore tend to be negative. I know not everyone has that concept, but the sympathetic nervous system, we are taught, is usually about fight or flight, while the parasympathetic is rest and digest, and typically we leave it at that. However, in the relationship to construction of emotions, and even in the conceptualization of stress, that's incomplete. As cognitive neuroscientists and physiologists will tell you, the main job of the nervous system is to maintain our body budget, to ensure that all our systems are working efficiently to perpetuate survival. The body budget mechanism that the brain is continuously tracking are numerous. And so it includes processes like temperature regulation, glucose metabolism, blood oxygen, carbon dioxide saturation, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. Another term for body budget is something called allostasis, which simply means constancy through change. So to survive, our brain predicts what the body will need to complete any task, even before those needs actually arise, to keep certain systems consistent amidst change. For instance, keeping the brain levels of oxygen concentration relatively stable no matter what's happening. An example of this: every time you are about to stand, your brain predicts what will happen, the energy required to change your position. And in order to ensure that you do not pass out, it sends signals back down to the body, causing blood pressure, heart rate, respiration to change, to adjust to the changing conditions, even before you actually stand or do a headstand. How we do this is through the regulation of the nervous system and that elaborate dance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Rather than think of these systems as all or nothing, remember that while one may be more dominant at any given moment, the other continues to operate. So if we now think of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems as a means to manage our body budget, we can begin to reconstruct our concept of emotion. We can then think in terms of arousal, energy, and activity, and it functions on a spectrum from high arousal, agitation, activation, to low arousal, activation, or alertness, depending on our body's need, our body budget. So looking at this image, we see a depiction of the sympathetic nervous system with its nerve fibers and what it innervates on the left, and the parasympathetic nervous system with its nerves and what it innervates on the right. Now, as this video is not a review of the different branches of the autonomic nervous system, I would like to simply and for the moment orient us to consider the sympathetic branch as the part that is useful to increasing our body budget, getting us to move, and that the parasympathetic is about restoring our body budget, preserving our body budget, and helping us settle. Again, I'm not saying fear, safety, fight or flight. We're just talking about increasing our energy to move and preserving and restoring our body budget. The release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucocorticoids or mineralocorticoids, those come from the sympathetic nervous system, and they emphasize increasing energy activation and alertness. And while acetylcholine released from the parasympathetic nervous system aids in slowing down the heart, for example. Slowing down the heart, decreasing our energy. And it helps with digestion and a number of other things. Again, I admit this is a bit of a simplification, but keep in mind that I am saying that the regulation of our nervous system is about maintaining our energy, our metabolic demand, based on whatever activity we are doing, which might not always be what we call stressful. This brings us back to the simulation part of the discussion. After the brain makes a prediction that the body is about to stand up, taste a lemon, see a snake or a dog, the brain sends signals down to the nervous system, to the body, to prepare. If the physiological demand is about to increase, as in standing up, then the sympathetic system will kick in. If preparations for digesting our food are required, then the parasympathetic system will be stimulated. This is one of the reasons we are taught about the importance of eating while resting and not engaging in other activity that stimulate the sympathetic system. It's counterproductive to managing our body budget. So this brings us to one of the first ways we can begin to work with our experiences, and for the purpose of this video, our so-called emotional experience. Whenever you feel or sense or experience something you call an emotion, pause and start by asking yourself, how energized am I in this moment? Again, think of this as a continuum from high alertness and activation or energy to low alertness, activation or energy. When we are full of energy, you might consider this agitated. When you're low energy, you might consider this to be calm. For those of you who are familiar with the polyvagal theory and the language around that framework, you might use the spectrum of mobilization to immobilization. In another video, I will address the challenges to Porges' polyvagal theory. But for now, we might consider the use of those terms, mobilization and immobilization, if that makes sense to you, and I like those words. So the first question we might ask to be more present and to work with our experience is, how alert, aroused, energized am I in this particular moment? Of course, there is a companion question that helps us to connect more directly with our sensory input, our interoception or exteroception, and that is, how do you know you are energized? What tells you? What sensations are you experiencing that indicate to you your state of activation and energy level? For instance, if you're experiencing a fluttering of the heart, a tingling of the limbs, a flushing of the face, is this increased energy? If you're feeling sluggish, your heaviness of the limbs, are you saying that is immobilized or calm? Can you identify and pinpoint the actual sensations that are arising right now? So, We could have high energy or low energy. Before returning to the story about my German Shepherd, let's repeat this again. Our brain is always making predictions based on previous experiences. Once those predictions are made, the brain sends signals back down to the body to prepare it to manage our body budget, thereby creating another cascade of physiological experiences. Then our brain compares what happens to our predictions, with our predictions. So let's go back to my example. I grew up with German Shepherds who I had only known to be sweet and playful. Notice every time I talk about that, my voice changes. My brain, therefore, predicted that all dogs that looked like mine were this way, and my nervous system responded in suit. I became energized and activated whenever a dog was in sight. My nervous system started to mobilize as I would quickly run towards all big furry dogs. Until one day, when an encounter caused my brain to reevaluate its predictive model by comparing my old established experience with this new one. My father was an attorney, and he knew many of the police officers in town. And one day when I was in the car with my dad going somewhere, I had to be about 7 years old at the time, he stopped and rolled down his window to chat with one of the officers who happened to be holding the leash of a rather large German Shepherd police dog. So, exteroception, my eyes saw the dog. Signal up to the brain. My brain made the prediction that it would be friendly and cuddly. It sent that simulation down to my body. My body propelled itself forward over my dad as I reached my hand out of the window to pet the top of the dog's head. And within seconds, the police officer was forcefully pulling the snarling, growling, snapping dog, who just barely missed biting my hand, away from the car, and my father shoved me back down to my seat. And I didn't understand why. My brain didn't get it. It had to compare my concept of dog with this brand new information. Does this new information match my prediction? That this dog would want his belly and head rubbed? Of course, that's what I thought. For all of us, our brains are always making predictions, simulations, and then comparing. If the sensory information matches and aligns with the prediction, then the simulation, nervous system's response, become reinforced. But if the sensory input does not match the prediction, then either the brain changes its categorizations and predictions and simulations, or it remains activated and agitated. In this example, my 7-year-old brain was confused as my body remained agitated. The sensory input I was receiving was threatening. I barely escaped from being bitten. And a new predictive model was being created. And for a long time afterwards, whenever I saw a dog, that new prediction was what was going on in my head. I was going to be attacked, and my body began to take steps to escape. So regardless as to whether the sensory input matched or not, now my brain continued to perpetuate, reinforce, rehearse the scenario that I would be attacked. It doesn't matter what kind of dog I saw, or what it looked like, or how it sounded. I would predict I would be attacked. For many of us, when our sensory input does not match with the predictions, our brain simulates something that is not present. And in my case here, I began to see snarling expressions on every dog, even when they weren't there. This, again, is something the brain will do. Some of this may be a result of priming. Some reflects the strength of our predictions and simulation cycle. We will see things when they're not there. We simulate it and continue to see that. One of the factors in all of this is that we don't readily befriend, identify, challenge, or even really know what we're experiencing. Since sensory input is what generates the cycle, we need to pause long enough to clarify and understand that input. So we ask, what am I sensing right now? Is it focused on the outside world, exteroception, the five senses, or is it on the internal world, interoception? This now shows us that we have two sets of questions to explore anytime we have an experience. The first is about our level of energy. How energized, alert, mobilized, aroused am I? And simultaneously, how do I know? And we know because of what our sensory experience is. Is it focused outward, exteroception, or inward? So when we feel that ache in the stomach, how often do we take time to really identify it and dialogue with it versus following and empowering whatever prediction is being made? That ache in the stomach might be food poisoning, indigestion. You might even say that it's nervousness, or maybe it's excitement. Let me share two examples. The first is of a woman I worked with years ago. Now, I recognize that as I'm telling you all of this and telling you her backstory, that it's priming you. It's priming how you'll interpret these events. However, that said, this young woman struggled to get pregnant. She had several miscarriages, several complications from her IVF procedures, and one of the IVF procedures resulted in getting an infection, and that resulted in a long, prolonged hospital stay. But finally, after about 8 years of trying, she became pregnant. But once pregnant, she stopped coming in. I didn't see her for the first 2 trimesters, basically. She came into my office, she sat down, and with a furrowed brow and an intensity in her voice, she said, "I have been anxious this entire pregnancy." Now, if we were to pause here, most of us would say, well, that's to be expected. No wonder. She had difficulty getting pregnant, and she even ended up in the hospital during one attempt. So, of course, she would be anxious. We're giving it a understanding. We're making a prediction ourselves here. And that thinking is analogous to the prediction cycle. However, rather than project my predictions onto her, I merely asked, well, how do you know? How do you know you're anxious? At first, she looked at me with this blank stare, then took a breath in and said, well, while smiling, I should say, well, I feel a fluttering in my stomach and my heart's racing all the time and I feel jittery in my arms. And without skipping a beat here, I said, wow, that sounds like excitement. I know that's not necessarily the most therapeutic way of saying this. I was not in any way attempting to dismiss or invalidate her experience in any way. And looking back, I could have approached it differently, but let's not get lost in that at this moment. She paused and she said, after a blank stare for a moment, oh my gosh, I'm excited. I'm going to have a baby. I'm going to have this baby. And with that, she got up and left my office beaming. Very short appointment. I checked in with her throughout the rest of her pregnancy and after the birth, and she continued to report being calmer, because she was no longer anxious, and she said she was basically excited. Now, part 2 of the story is that I shared this specific story with all my students in my first week of my mind-body medicine course. On the last week of the quarter, one of the students stood up and shared something. She said that all her life, she had this narrative that she suffers from test anxiety. But upon hearing that story about the pregnant woman, she decided to reflect on the accuracy of her story. So at the very next test, and being in medical school, she had lots of them, she asked herself the question that I just posed. 1, how activated, energized, mobilized am I? And how do I know? What sensory input am I using to confirm that? So checking in, she identified her experience, the ones in her body, and she noticed an elevated heart rate, and she noticed a bit more sweaty palms, I believe. However, she then said to herself, oh, this is excitement. She then told the class that after her lifelong career as a student, for the remainder of the quarter, she did not experience test anxiety any longer. And she now actively looks forward to taking tests. And I followed up with her throughout the rest of her education, and she said that really changed everything for her. Were it that easy? I'm admitting that it's not. But it speaks to how we can work with our experiences. And it brings us to this next concept, affect. Affect. Affect is this general state of feeling, this feeling tone that we call a mood, right? And it is completely interoceptive dependent. It is dependent on what we're feeling inside our body. As such, it is made up of two different components. Something we call valence, which is the quality we assign a sensory experience. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? And the second we've already talked about, arousal. Are we calm, agitated? It's how energized we are. This brings us to the first one, how energized are we? But then the valence is about how pleasant something is. Now, what do? When something is pleasant, we deem it good. When something's unpleasant, we deem it bad. So how unpleasant or how pleasing is this experience? And that's what kicks off our cascade. If something is pleasing, we'll want to lean forward towards it. We'll want to embrace it, or we'll want way more of it. So the body is going to predict what it needs to get that and hold on to that. If it's unpleasant, we want to push it away, block it. And the body, budget, will act accordingly. If we put these things together, we get something called the affective circumplex. This is based on the work of James Russell. This is a similar graph adapted from Lisa Feldman Barrett's book on how emotions are made, and many therapists will use this. What we do is then put our experience, notice I didn't say emotion, our experience on this continuum in these quadrants. If I'm feeling very energized by something and I call it pleasing, like the student did. She originally said she was very energized, but it was unpleasant, bottom right quadrant. High valence of unpleasantness, but high arousal. But what she did is transformed it and said high arousal, but pleasant valence. And that became excitement versus anxiety. So one thing I'm suggesting here in this is that we can begin first by just checking in with our experience. What is it that we are experiencing in any given moment? And put it into these quadrants. And we can look at this in different ways. We can talk about the valence, we can talk about the energy, and we can also add in here the interoception and exteroception. There's another aspect of this. It's about our focus. And this will also speak to how we can work with our experience. While our focus is on our interoceptive experience, our sweaty palms, our heart rate, is our focus immersive or is it distanced? Meaning, how broad is it? Immersive focusing means we zero into the experience and we don't see anything else. We are stuck in one perspective. A distanced focus is where we zoom the lens out. So while I may be noticing my heart beating faster, and maybe even my breath being more rapid, that would be immersive if I just stay with those. But distanced would be then pulling back out and looking at all the rest of my bodily experiences. I might find a tightness in my shoulders, but I also might find warmth in my feet. I might feel a softness in my thighs. I might even feel a softness in the belly. By changing our focus, we then can change our predictive cycle. I want to bring up this idea of regulating our body budget in context of children. And this also gets into the notion of attachment theory. When born, babies cannot regulate their body budget. If they're hungry, they can't get up and get some food. If they're thirsty, they can't get something to drink. If they need to change their diaper, they can't do it themselves. They have an internal state, an affective state, a interoceptive experience. So they experience this internal state and they then express it. So the internal state goes up to their brain and they express it the only way they can because they're trying to regulate their body budget. Someone help me. What happens next, though, is this outside force, this caregiver, somebody else out there, has to respond to the expression. So the caregiver is giving a prediction, right? The caregiver is saying, okay, they're crying, it's because they're thirsty. They're crying because they're hungry. Oh, crying because they're tired. They're making a prediction. So it's working on both entities, both individuals, the newborn, the infant, as well as the adult. They're making a prediction and then acting on it. And the child, once they make an expression, they make their expression and they then learn to predict whether their expression will have the impact that they want. I cry and no one comes. What do I learn? I learn because of my experience, my sensory input. Nobody is there. I'm crying. No one comes to touch me. No one comes to feed me, to change me. And so the learning begins not on a conscious level. I can't expect anyone to be there for me. And I'm speaking very broadly, of course. I might have this expression and someone comes. Someone comes with a calm nature, tries to soothe me, changes my clothes, feeds me when I need, and I might develop a secure attachment. Or somebody comes and handles me forcefully. I might learn, I'm not sure I really want that help. So we're making predictions, both the infant and the child, and this is connecting to this idea of attachment theory, which fits with this idea of constructed emotions. In her work, Lisa Feldman Barrett is very explicit in saying that we need to debunk this old belief that there is one specific area of the brain, the amygdala, that's the fear center, that this other area of the brain is the joy center. That these constructions of emotion, since it involves so much sensory input from so many different senses, prediction, simulation, a collective group of areas of the brain are involved. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to leave it at that. So as a biofeedback mind-body medicine practitioner, I have always heard about Elmer Green, one of the fathers of modern biofeedback, who said every change in the physiological state is accompanied by an appropriate change in the mental emotional state, conscious or unconscious. And conversely, every change in the mental emotional state, conscious or unconscious, is accompanied by an appropriate change in the physiological state. And I've always resonated with that because every time we think a thought, we think of the lemon, we see a physiological change. Likewise, when we have a physiological change, we get a massage, take a warm bath, our thoughts often change as well. But now with this idea of constructed emotion, where we see this cycle, it makes more sense. Mind and body are connected. We have interoception and exteroception. Input, sensory input, comes to the brain, and the brain makes representations of these, categorizes things. When it happens again, those categorizations are connected to our predictions. We make predictions about what is going to happen, and that then sends signals down to the body, to the nervous system, to make simulations, preparing the body to balance its budget based on what it predicts will happen. Then, when those things happen or don't happen, we compare the experience, the new sensory experience, with the predictive models. And we could either change the predictive models. Hey, not everybody is unfriendly. Oh, maybe people are unfriendly. Every time I eat this, something will happen. Maybe it won't. Let me provide an example that hopefully you don't have personal experience with, but will make sense. Food poisoning. I've had food poisoning a few times in my life, and as a result of this, one of my favorite foods, salmon. Could be sushi, could be other things. So what happens here? We eat something that we might be familiar with, something we've known and enjoyed and liked and loved many times. And then a new reaction happens. So what's happening here? I eat the salmon, I taste it. I don't necessarily taste that there's anything wrong with it because I may be eating without really paying attention to what's going on. My brain already has a representation of salmon. Oh, and maybe I even did taste the salmon, but because my prediction is so strong that it's going to taste a certain way, maybe I tasted it. Maybe it tasted fine because I was really allowing the prediction model to work. The simulation occurred, I digested it. Now, what happened is then, several hours later, when the nausea, the vomiting, and the other things started to happen, my brain began to compare what really happened with its representations and predictions. The resolution was that the reaction was so strong, it upended my previous prediction. And so then for a while, the smell of salmon, the thought of salmon, the image of salmon, just thinking of it, I began to feel nauseous. My body made a prediction, and there was a simulation, and I felt nauseous. Well, this makes sense, how this could be beneficial. If I don't have the convenience of stores to buy food, places that already cook my food for me, and I'm out in the wild and I have to eat something, if I see something and I taste it and I have this reaction, it will help keep me safe in the future. So this is another example of constructed experience. We might not use the word emotion here until I say salmon. Ooh, I feel averse to it. It's unpleasant. I don't like it. I feel disgusted. That could be the emotion. So my intention with this video is to provide a framework for understanding emotions so that we might then be able to develop some skills in learning how to work with them and our experience. Whether we label these emotions or experiences as positive, meaning that we give them a valence of pleasant, or negative, whether we give them a valence of unpleasant. Once we understand that this is the way we make sense of the world, this opens the door to explore how to develop a relationship with our experience so that we do not feel victim to our experiences. Now, I want to shift the focus away from this part to address ways I believe the skills developed from mind-body modalities can be implemented to help train our brain and nervous system, and perhaps develop new ways of being in the world. Well, this will not be an in-depth discussion about the various mind-body approaches that I use and teach with others. I hope to just elucidate that these practices directly relate to the construction of our emotion and experience. For me, the language I use to inquire how people make sense of the world and their predictions and simulations is called orientation. How do you orient to the world? This word makes sense to me personally, and it speaks to the relationship between our sensory input, our sensory experience, and felt sense, and the ensuing simulation or reaction of the nervous system and body. What I am interested in is the individual's pattern. And these familiar items are the components that comprise our orientation pattern. Am I orienting to this moment in an energized or agitated manner, or am I orienting in depleted energetically, immobilized or calm way? Do I find myself orienting to this experience and moment in a way that I consider pleasing or unpleasant? And the last category here, am I orienting in this moment in a narrowly focused and immersive way, such that all I can consider, see, imagine, focus on is this one specific aspect? Or am I looking at this moment and my experience in a more expansive and distanced way? That last point is very useful to consider for any conversation of pain, for example, whether it's physical or emotional pain. Whenever we tend to ruminate, our thoughts tend to fixate on a particular aspect. In the example of that pregnant woman with the history of miscarriages, an immersive, ruminating focus would be directing all the attention on one prediction, that another miscarriage was imminent. Many people often say statements like, "I'm worried about the unknown," or "I'm afraid what might happen." However, I don't believe that is really accurate. Upon further investigation, what I find is that a very specific prediction is being made and rehearsed over and over and over again. And it's not as vague as we originally describe. If I am truly uncertain about the future, then what might transpire could be pleasant, it could be unpleasant, or even neutral. Yet those pleasant and neutral predictions do not lead to activation of the nervous system or simulations that I find unpleasant and hence will call anxiety. Unless, of course, I am not fully cognizant and aware of what my interoceptive experience is, much like the woman who, upon reflection, reassigned a new valence to her energized experience. In stress management, whatever is the eliciting stimulus that we identify, whether it's outside or inside the body, is the stressor. It is a trigger, and on its own, in this model, it is simply neutral. Once the brain assigns a valence to the sensory input and initiates a prediction of how to manage the body budget, do we have what is called a stress response. Okay, so just to review that part of the process, this quote from the Sutta Nipata, considered by some scholars to contain some of the oldest Buddhist teachings and practices, sum up what we have been discussing from a neuroscience perspective all along. Conflicts arise from what is held dear. That holding things dear arises from longing. That longing arises from what is pleasant and unpleasant in the world, which arises from contact, which in turn arises from being in the world. Again, here we have come full circle, ending where we began. It is sensory awareness that brings us in contact with the world. And that sensory input is value neutral until we place a valence on it of pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad. As a result of that valence, our brain and nervous system, or brain and body, it takes off. For those things we find pleasant, we tend to crave, desire, want more of, and then activate our nervous system to mobilize to get it. Those things that we find unpleasant, we may also mobilize to actively move away from them. We could also immobilize and become inactive to try desperately to prevent losing what we are experiencing in this moment or to prevent something unpleasant from coming our way. Thus said, the question still remains, how do we begin to work with our experience? If we are to start at the beginning of the cycle, cultivating our relationship with our sensory experience would be the first step. This brings us to the mental practice and skill of mindfulness. So much is being written and studied about mindfulness, but for the sake of our conversation, I would like to discuss it simply as mental training and a way to see things more clearly. As an overall practice, think of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, as comprised of 3 specific skills. The very first is concentration. With mindfulness practice, we are training the mind to direct its attention on a particular object, often called the anchor. And we're directing our attention there repeatedly. This could be either our interoceptive experience, sensory information about our physical body, or it could be some exteroceptive experience, some object we gaze at, something we are hearing, something we smell, taste, touch. All of these could be anchors. The concentration portion of mindfulness practice helps us direct the brain and the mind back to the anchor over and over and over again. Whenever our attention wanders away from the anchor, we practice bringing it back again and again. And this takes us then to the second skill of mindfulness practice, which is mindfulness itself. So here I'm distinguishing between mindfulness as a skill and the overall mindfulness practice. Mindfulness as a skill has been defined as attending to a particular experience, anchor, without judgment or elaboration. Whatever the object of our focus may be, we keep our attention resting with the actual experience rather than prescribe or assign a valence to it, such as pleasant or unpleasant, but also good or bad, right or wrong, perfect or imperfect fit here. Whenever we observe such thoughts enter into our conscious awareness, we see that the attention has wandered away from the anchor, and we simply observe ourselves thinking. The practice of thinking becomes the momentary anchor. Now, the third skill in any mindfulness practice is equanimity, where we are practicing maintaining an even and balanced disposition or attitude towards ourselves, and in this practice, whenever the mind wanders. Now, I can't tell you the dozens and dozens of people with whom I have worked who struggle with this skill of equanimity the most. Part of this may be due to the inaccurate notion that the goal of mindfulness is the cessation of all thinking. That is just not the intent. The skill of mindfulness involves concentration, mindfulness itself, non-judgment, and equanimity. Whenever the mind wanders, it is merely another opportunity to practice non-judgment, not striving, compassion. However, if our predictive model is that a wandering mind is bad, then our nervous system is going to become activated in a way that we find unpleasant every time a new thought occurs. Through the practice of mindfulness, we can interrupt our predictive cycle by pausing and creating more insight as to the nature of the sensory input that is making its way to the brain. Now, the Buddha provided some instructions in the practice of mindfulness that began with interoception of the body simply sitting and then the body breathing. The idea was just to be present to and concentrate and focus on bodily sensations. Eventually, he suggested turning your attention to your valence, noticing whether you feel and experience a sensation, whether or not it's from inside the body, outside the body, whether you are labeling it as pleasing or unpleasant. By learning to stop and simply be present to those aspects alone, we are addressing the first part of the cycle. And personally, I believe that all psychotherapy and counseling and every mind-body modality contains skills of mindfulness. And I believe all of us can benefit from learning how to orient to our sensory experience with a more focused, accepting, and compassionate manner. Mindfulness practice does not need to look like sitting silently on a beach with your eyes closed, watching the breath. There are many different forms of mindfulness practice. Regardless, mindfulness training is an excellent way to connect with your sensory experience, to identify what sensory input is coming to the brain, and help you recognize the often unconscious valence we are assigning to our experience. The next part of this cycle of prediction, of construction and motion, is specifically the prediction and the simulation. The mind-body approaches of guided imagery, as well as compassion and loving kindness meditation, can also interrupt this cycle. So guided imagery is where you are purposefully and intentionally calling to mind a situation, an experience, a person, place, or thing. And the goal, of course, is to think of something with a positive valence, something you find meaningful and activates a desired simulation. Just like the lemon example earlier, I imagine most people listening to this, if they truly were focusing on the image or thought about a lemon, experienced a change in their physiology. So according to this model of constructed emotion, every one of us are visualizing and imagining all day long. We just are often not aware of it. The term imagery, guided imagery, can also be used in place of visualization because they were trying to connote that guided imagery involves all the senses, not just your visual field. So take a moment and ask yourself, what am I predicting and imagining throughout my day? If I make the very broad statement, as I mentioned already, I just wonder what's going to happen next. I have to pause and ask myself, am I really predicting, imagining, seeing, hearing in my mind nothing happening? Or am I really predicting something specific? Am I really hearing my boss yelling at me? Am I feeling a sense of hunger and then seeing myself starving without food? What are you imagining? Or, as I like to say, what are you practicing and rehearsing, consciously or unconsciously, in this moment? The practice of gratitude, where we call to mind and then practice embodying, basically simulating, the interoceptive response of gratitude, is a really important practice. Many forms of gratitude and compassion meditation exist, and one of my favorites and easiest is to call to mind someone, something towards which you feel love and appreciation without question. According to my colleague who works at the VA hospital, and in my own personal experience with patients, the number one thing people who are diagnosed with PTSD and stress and trauma tend to call to mind to think of something they appreciate and love are their animals. When I think of my cats here, Luna and Jake, my internal sensory experience shifts and I sense a warmth in my chest and a regulating or a calming of my energy, and all of which I label as pleasant. There is a type of meditation, metta meditation, known as loving kindness meditation, where you are instructed to call to mind, so it's imagery, various people, and then continue the imagery by imagining sending them wishes of safety, of health, of peace, of happiness and ease. In this practice, the anchor then becomes several. One, the imagery of the various people to whom you are sending this loving kindness or metta, the image of you actively sending them the energy, and the phrases themselves. The silent recitation of these phrases helps hone your attention, concentration, so that it doesn't wander off. In metta practice, you are invited to call to mind someone with whom you struggle. However, rather than imagining and predicting the habitual and automatic cycle you are already finding yourself in, you create a novel, eliciting stimulus by imagining sending them wishes of safety, health, peace, and ease. So keep that in mind. Usually when you call to mind someone with whom you struggle, this is done at the end of the metta meditation practice. We prime ourselves, remember priming, by thinking of someone with whom it's easy to send loving kindness. Once we do that, then we begin to think of someone that's difficult and challenging, rather than fall back into that predictive loop where we see the struggle and the conflict. We think of them, we're already primed, and we imagine doing something different than we always do. We imagine sending them safety, health, peace, and ease. Thus, you're creating a new simulation, and we will feel different about the stimulus, the trigger, that person, than we did before. So this is just several practices. There are other practices like hypnosis, whether self-hypnosis or guided hypnosis, and something called autogenic training. These are similar in how we interrupt that prediction simulation cycle. Lastly, many mind-body approaches directly change the sensory information detected by the brain. By changing the body, we modulate our body budget. Physical movement-based approaches like progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, tai chi, qigong, but even Pilates and other forms of exercise not only can increase or decrease our metabolic demand and output, regulate our body budget, they can also release tension in the muscles and organs, thereby sending new information back up to the brain that will initiate a new cycle. So, in the practice of systematic desensitization, individuals are taught first how to relax their physical, their somatic body in a quiet and safe setting. Then, over time, slowly stressors or images of stressors are introduced. So while contemplating or experiencing these stressors directly, the brain makes its prediction, which starts the simulation process. But now, the individual is trained in a way to redirect that simulation. It's specifically trained in relaxing the body. And when we can do this, people no longer have an increase in activation and create a new somatic experience they consider pleasing and then thus less triggering. So this is a way we can work with our prediction simulation cycle. This is by no means an exhaustive list of mind-body modalities. This is merely one potential conceptualization, basically mine, of the ways the skills of various mind-body approaches can be used to work with our experiences and our emotions. At the very least, I hope this gave you a new way of looking at your emotional world and your experiences. And perhaps you got some glimpse of how mind-body approaches, meditation, mindfulness, guided imagery, loving kindness practices can help us work better with our experiences. I welcome any questions, and as always, you can reach me through my website, thebreathspace.com. Until next time, thank you for watching, and may you go gently, knowing your goodness.